not only in the church, but how do we treat our neighbors? How do we treat our friends and our loved ones? So let's give a warm Grace Life welcome to Pastor Misty today.
Thank you. Well, good morning, church. So glad to be here today. So grateful that they could find me a music stand. That is short preacher problems there. And so I want to just say thank you and welcome to everybody here in the sanctuary this morning and as well online. So glad to be a part of this worship service with you today. And you know, this is the first Sunday that I feel like we are really kind of getting into the swing of the brand new year. The last couple of Sundays we've celebrated holidays, and prior to that we were in great anticipation for Advent to come and for Christmas. And so I always feel like this Sunday is kind of where the rubber meets the road, right? And so over the holidays, I'm sure, as you did, many of you met with family or you had family to your home, and it's generally around a lot of really good food. And so we do that too in our family and my husband's family. My mother-in-law and my sister-in-law are amazing cooks. They really are. And so we always look forward to the opportunity to go and have dinner with them. And generally, I've been in this family for about 32 years. And so generally the rule of thumb is when we have a big family gathering, everybody says, what should I bring? And so generally also, I've been asked usually to bring cold vegetables and something crunchy in a bag. And that's okay. That's all right. See, my gifting is not necessarily in the kitchen. I mean, I can cook a meal, trust me, but so this year I was asked to bring vegetables, and so I got on Pinterest and I was like, okay, I'm going to do a really good job. And I looked around and I saw some ideas of vegetables on a tray in the shape of a Christmas tree, and that's nice. I don't think I can do that, but my husband is an amazing artist. So I gave that task to him, and he did a great job with it. It looked wonderful. The cherry tomatoes kind of looked like Christmas bulbs, and it was great. And then I was asked to bring pretzels. So I was like, okay. So I went out and found some really nice, fancy, hard pretzels, like little squares. And then I went and bought some chocolate hummus, dark chocolate hummus. And if you have never had dark chocolate hummus, I'm going to tell you, go to the store after church today and get some. And by the way, you're welcome, because it is delicious. It is wonderful. It tastes like frosting, but you're kind of eating something healthy. And then I thought, I'm going to really go over the top this year. I'm going to make this dish memorable. So I bought some of those soft pretzels already made, the ones that look like they have the little salt, on them perfectly placed, and you can warm them up, and they're warm and delicious. And I thought, I'm going to make a homemade cheese dip. So I got online, and I kind of found a couple of recipes. We went to the store to buy all the supplies, and what happens usually is what happens to me is I kind of accidentally melded some of the recipe together. So I got everything, and Christmas morning, I'm putting it together. And those of you who cook, one thing that's really important is to follow directions. So what happened is I began to melt the butter, and then slowly you're supposed to add in the flour. And what happens if you're a cook if you just dump all the flour in at one time? Yeah, I see somebody shaking their head. Yeah, you end up with great big lumps of flour, and it's not pretty. I just want to tell you that right now. So I kept stirring it and trying to mash out the lumps, and I just kept adding stuff and liquid and the cheese, and I ended up with I had a sharp cheddar cheese and mozzarella, and when you really add those together, it's really not that good. Then I was supposed to put some spices on that I had in my cupboard, and I didn't, so I just found some like miscellaneous Mexican spices, and I just kept dumping that. And it was, and I just kept putting stuff in, and had my whisk trying to beat out those lumps. And I asked my son Alex, I said, Alex, can you come over and taste this? Here's one of these nice, soft pretzels. And he dipped it in there, and he's like, tastes like cheese. Okay. So I had it in this little crock pot, and we drove up to my sister-in-law's house, which is about, from Grove City to Delaware, about a 40-minute drive. And we got there, and I started to unveil everything that we had brought, and I lifted the top off of that little cute little crock pot, and it kind of in the drive kind of congealed together, and I thought, oh boy, this is not good. And so we turned it on, and I started trying to whip it and to get it to be smoother. So it finally heated up, and my niece came over to me and said, Aunt Misty, what did you bring? And I said, well, I was really excited to try this new recipe, this cheese dip. And I took the top off, and she looked at it, and she's very sweet. She said, well, you tried, it's okay. And so I took that crock pot home completely full, pretty much, of the cheese, the congealed cheese. And by the time we got it home, we were putting things back in the fridge. And Mike says, what'd you do with your cheese in the crock pot? I'm like, I just threw it all away. I'm just done. The crock pot had a big dent in it, so I just kind of was done with that. So I share that story to tell you that if you are not gifted in the kitchen, the good news today is that radical hospitality can be expressed in a variety of different ways. It's not just about cooking. I love how Henry Nouwen, he's a theologian, he says this about radical hospitality. He says, hospitality means primarily the creation of free space where the stranger can enter and become a friend instead of an enemy. Hospitality is not to change people. I love that. Hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them space where change can take place. It's not to bring men and women over to our side, but to offer freedom, not disturbed by dividing lines. Radical hospitality, when translated from Greek to Latin, the word radical is actually a Latin word, is radix, which means root or great change or a cause of a great change. And then hospitality is derived from two Greek words, philos, which means love, and xenos, which means stranger. So when you put that all together, it means love of strangers. Radical hospitality is causing great change by showing love to strangers. And God's word has a lot to say about hospitality as well. I'll start with this one first, because this text in Hebrews always has really intrigued me, and it always spoke to me. And in Hebrews 13, 1 and 2, it says, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers. For by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. And so I love this, that our entire Bible is packed full of instances and opportunities where they're showing radical hospitality to folks. And it's not just in the New Testament. I have a little chart here that I kind of graphed out. And if I were to completely fill everything out, there's no way I would have, that's all we would have done today. But in the Old Testament, it says, starting with Isaiah 58, it says, religious rituals cannot replace relationship and caring for one another. And then in Leviticus as well, it talks about how taking care of foreigners, I love this, when they come into your land, that we're supposed to treat them like they're our own. Treat them like they're our own. In Deuteronomy, it says, show hospitality to the widows and the orphans and aliens of the land. And it's speaking to the Hebrews, and it's saying, because you were once aliens in Egypt. And then moving to the New Testament, 1 Timothy 5:10 says, devote ourselves to good deeds by loving others well. And then in Titus, it is talking about leadership in the church, and clergy and lay leaders as well. It says, rather, this person must be hospitable, one who loves what is good, who is self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. And then this is one of my favorites in 1 Peter. And above all, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. You see, hospitality in biblical times was an important part of the culture, and inviting others to your home, whether you knew them or not, to sit down with them and provide a meal for them and care for them. It was an essential part of the culture. But Jesus warns us. He says, make sure that your heart is in the right attitude when you're inviting others to the table. You see, Jesus was invited to a dinner. The leader of the Pharisees invited him, and it was a very grand banquet, okay? Think like long tables full of food. If it were happening in this culture, in this context, local dignitaries, all the church leadership around us. It was kind of a big deal. But Jesus, instead of just coming in and enjoying it, he decided to use this as a very teachable moment. And in Luke 14:12, he says, he turned to the host and he said, when you put on a luncheon or a banquet, he said, don't invite your friends and your brothers and your relatives and your rich neighbors, for they will invite you back, and that will be your only reward. He says, instead, invite the poor, invite the crippled, the lame and the blind, and then in the resurrection of the righteous, God will reward you for inviting those who could not repay you. We all do it in this culture, right? We go out to lunch with someone and they say, I'll pay, and you say, okay, I'll get the next one. Or we have, when we were younger, and we would have our small groups, and kids were all running all over the place. We would have it at somebody's house or a dinner at someone's house, and then the next time we would say, next time it's your turn. We've all experienced that. But what they're trying to tell us here, what he's trying to tell us here is when we say welcome to strangers, or when we feed the hungry, or we put down our weapons, we're not being leftist or woke. We're simply quoting Jesus. The book of Luke was written for those who were already following Jesus' own resurrection. And so in Luke 9:23, he says, then he said to the crowd, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Take up your own cross daily and follow me. You see, Jesus is calling us to step out of being around our own kind and our own comfort. God doesn't really care if we're comfortable. What he cares about is if we are obedient. Biblical hospitality, it's costly, and there's a pretty steep learning curve. And generally, it's going to be a little bit tricky sometimes. To love like Jesus, we must be absolutely dependent on the Holy Spirit. We must be sure that we're staying connected to the vine, and we must be sure, like Pastor Josh talked about last week, staying rooted in God's word. 1 Peter 4:8-9 says, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. But this is the next part that really gets me. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Well, a few years ago, my husband and I, we invited 3 or 4 families over into our house on Sunday nights to walk through a series that we were doing currently at church in homes called Alpha. It was the Alpha course. And so everybody came in and we shared food together, and they brought their kids and their littles, and we have a finished basement downstairs. So what we did is we kind of put some games down there and some snacks and all kinds of stuff, Legos, and they were old enough to be down there without having direct supervision. We were right upstairs. And so, we would all eat together, and then the parents would come upstairs and we'd watch a talk, and then we would, discuss the talk and talk about things like life and faith and meaning. And my husband and I really worked hard at listening to hear what they were saying and not just listening to respond with a Sunday school answer. And so after this was all done, everybody went home and we were getting the kitchen cleaned up. So we'd walk down into the basement on that first night. Oh, it looked like a bomb had gone off. And our kids are older, right? So, we weren't used to having littles. But man, there were fruit snacks, gummies ground under the carpet. I mean, they were just being kids. They weren't being destructive. That's just what kids do. And they played, and somebody lost their flip-flop. I mean, I didn't find it until like a year later. I mean, really, it was like, oh, my stars. And my husband and I, we are kind of neatniks. Our kids always say, we're a little OCD when it comes to cleaning the house. I was like, okay, whatever. But you see, it was a little uncomfortable. Biblical hospitality is a little bit costly. And in that moment of a little bit of grumbling, I thought to myself, oh, we've got to clean this up every night for the next 8 weeks. It got better, trust me, it did. So see, Jesus isn't just telling us to stop there, right? He's telling us to keep going the extra mile, because it's not in our own strength that we're doing this, it's in the work of the Holy Spirit. Titus 1:8 tells us that a leader of the church must be hospitable. When I say leaders of the church, I mean church members, right? I mean lay leader as well as clergy must be hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. But what I have found, though, from those small group experiences and over the years in ministry, in my experience, some of the most profound discipleship moments happen in ordinary moments of relationship. I want to practice this for a minute. So I want to ask you to look into your mind's eye, and I want to paint a picture for you. And I borrowed this illustration from a pastor out in Oregon. And I want you to think about that you have a new friend. You have a friend, and they have invited you to come to the restaurant where they're a brand new waiter. And it's a nice restaurant. It's a very busy restaurant. It's a little bit expensive. And so you accept the invitation to come. It's their very first night. And you sit in their section as they've requested. And you have to wait an hour to get to your seat. But that's okay, because it's your friend and you want to support them. And you finally get seated. And then he finally brings the water, and then disappears, and about 30 minutes later, they come back, and then they actually take your order. But that's your friend, so you want to love that friend and support that friend. And then they finally take your order, and it comes out, and it's not quite right. And it's a little bit cold, but you eat it, right? And you're grateful, and you're supporting. You're telling that friend, good job, keep going, you're doing great. Okay, yeah, we're here for you, we're supporting you. And then it takes quite a while to get the check. And it's kind of mixed up, and it wasn't really great service, but you leave a big old tip, right? Because that's your friend, and you want to care well for that friend. And so through that experience, now I want you to kind of paint a different picture in your mind. Even as Christians, there are different personality types and little quirks that may just kind of rub us the wrong way a little bit. It's not that we don't love everyone, we do, but there are some personalities or what have you that just kind of maybe don't mesh with yours. And I want you to think of somebody in your circle of influence like that. Now I want you to imagine that you're back at that table again. And that person in your brain that you thought about comes up, and it's their first night waiting tables at this really busy restaurant. And you know they're doing the best that they can. Are you going to be able to show that radical hospitality to that person as well? And you see, I love that, because that's exactly what Jesus did. When Jesus shared something important with his friends, he invited them to a meal. You see, he included even the ones he knew that were going to deny him and that would betray him. While I was studying for this message, I noticed that Jesus preached to the priests and the Pharisees and the large crowds. But when he showed radical hospitality, it was to those who were in the margins. When he went to Zacchaeus' house, he had a meal with him. And he sat down and he talked and he ate and he shared his heart and his thoughts and his life. And after that, he said, "Come follow me. Come follow me." He would listen and love and teach. And he would meet those people exactly where they were. I love this story in Mark 1:40. It tells a story about Jesus and his apostles were teaching through the Galilee, and they come upon a man with leprosy. And leprosy in those days, it was really, really brutal. Not that it's not brutal today, but there were all kind of social stigmas surrounded with, leprosy. And it was very isolating, and it was extremely painful. And anyone with leprosy, when they came into a crowd, they had to announce to everybody, "Unclean, unclean." No one touched a person with leprosy. They were outcasts, and they were required to live apart from their family and their friends and their communities. The text says this. It says a man with leprosy came, and he knelt in front of Jesus, begging to be healed. Begging him. He said, "Jesus, heal me." And Jesus said, "I am willing." And then Jesus said, "Be healed." Instantly, the leprosy disappeared, and the man was healed. And what I love so much about this verse is that Jesus didn't say, "Wait, go get cleaned up first, and then I'll heal you." He didn't say, "Go get clean." See, the first thing that he did is he answered the man's question, "Will you heal me?" "Yes, I will," he said. And I imagine that man with leprosy was probably pretty physically in bad shape. I imagine his clothes were pretty ragged and tattered. I imagine he probably had not showered in quite some time. I imagine that his hair was probably matted down, and I bet his hands were so stained from dirt that they were probably dark. See, leprosy in those days was like a plague. And anytime this man came into town, right, he had to say, "Unclean, unclean." And can you imagine how incredibly lonely he must have been? Can you imagine how disheartening that would be? That every time he came into contact with people, he would never be touched, not have a handshake. He would not even have somebody look him in the face. All they would see was the back of his head, of the people's head, because they were running away because they were afraid. But see, what Jesus did is before he even healed him, he invited him into the fold. That's just so Jesus. I just love that. In our humanity, gosh, it's easier to offer that kind of radical hospitality to those people that are like us. It is just easier in our humanity. But God doesn't require us to just stay safe. Remember, he wants our obedience. Last summer, we had a family member that was very sick, and my husband and I had spent a couple of days at their home caring for this family member, and it was a pretty tough couple of days. And by the end of the second day, we found ourselves going to the emergency room. And as my husband was handling everything that needed to be handled, I found myself sitting alone in the waiting area. and I noticed a young man was being wheeled in. He was too weak to walk into the ER, so they had a wheelchair for him. It was either his caregiver or his partner. I don't know. It doesn't matter which. And they brought him in, and I want to paint the scene for you a little bit, just because I want you to have that vision. And he came in and he sat next to the administration desk, and he was in his chair, and he was shaking, he was cold, and I just wanted to take a big fluffy blanket and just wrap it around him. And he had this green and blue hair, and I noticed his nails were painted black, and he had a lot of tattoos and ear piercings and piercings all over, and his clothes were a little bit ragged, and I don't tell you that as a judgment. I tell you that to set the scene for you and paint the picture, okay? And as I sat there waiting for my family, I felt the Lord speak to me. Not audibly, but in my head and in my spirit. And he said, pray for this man. And I began to do that. And then I felt the Lord nudging me to go over and ask if I could put my hand on his shoulder and say, I pray to Jesus. Can I pray to Jesus for you? And I felt the Lord was nudging me to do that. And I'd love to stand here today and tell you that I got up out of my seat and I went right over to him and I did that. But I didn't. I didn't. I just stayed and prayed. And then it was time for me to leave. And I want to tell you, walking out those doors, I felt that conviction immediately. See, the Lord had told me to go do something, to go reach out, to go be the hands and feet of Jesus to that man, and I didn't do it. Don't worry. I asked for forgiveness. And I said, Lord, give me another chance. I'll always be obedient. I'll always be obedient. I have a friend who's a pastor, not around here locally, but where his church is situated is in a lower economic neighborhood, and across from the church is a bar, and they serve food. And this pastor told me, he's like, I don't know how many times I felt the nudge to go over and begin eating lunch once a week in that establishment. But he said he felt like he worried so much. What would congregants think if they saw his car parked there? And so, wow. You see, radical hospitality, it's not about our comfort. I love it that in Matthew 11:28, it says, he said to me, come all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. You see, Jesus says, come to the table, share a meal with me. Let's break bread together. Let's share life together. Today, we're going to end our service with a song from a group called Sidewalk Prophets, and it's called Come to the Table. And I love how it reminds us that we were all once outsiders as well. But through the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ and the work that he did on the cross for me and for you and for the guy in the ER and for the people who frequent the bar across the street from the church, we can be set free. I want to encourage you to invite those people and your circle of influence to come to the table. And as followers of Christ, we are great vessels of grace and of mercy. I want to encourage you to think about reflecting over a couple of things during the time of the song and however God would speak to you. Who can you show radical hospitality to this week? Where can you show radical hospitality this week? Whether that's you're standing in line at one of the big box stores, You know, I always have to pray for a lot of patience and grace when I'm standing there in line at some of those. Is God calling you to step into a serving opportunity maybe here at church, here at Grace Life? To ensure that everybody who walks through these doors is encountering radical hospitality. So I just want you to take a moment